people, protesting some just horrible, egregious acts. As you noted, the future of work, how we work, all those things are out there for discussion. Trust in institutions, and trust or an understanding, as Ben said, of literally the basis of our society. I saw a great quote. I mean, we've had the 1619 Project, we've had the book called 1620, 1776 Commission, all of them designed to push back on that. I saw a great quote from a noted political scientist who said, "America is not a lie, but a disappointment because it is a hope." Would you agree that that's a good description? And would you also agree that the U.S. is an exceptional country? Ben, I'll start with you.
I mean, I obviously believe that the United States is an exceptional country. I think that our history is filled with moments of glory. It's also filled with some terrible tragedy and some terrible evil. There's no question about any of that. To suggest that America is a disappointment is to suggest that utopia is a real place, or that whenever you say somebody's a disappointment, you have to say compared to what? What exactly are you shooting for? Compared to the ideal, of course, everybody's a disappointment. Saints are disappointments compared to the ideal. But if what you're talking about is America as a whole is somehow disappointing compared to, for example, what other countries around the world stand for, or what they have provided to their citizens, or what they have provided to the globe, then by no means is America a disappointment. America is a tremendous success story. In fact, it's the greatest success story in world history.
So there are parts of that I agree with, some parts that I disagree with. For the most part, I just want to note that the idea of America is an incredible idea. I think that the country has failed to live up to its ideals. I think that there are certain things that are transpiring as we speak that go unchecked. We are supposed to have a system of checks and balances, but I think more often than not, we see a system that is in fact rigged in favor of the powerful. I'll give you specific examples. In the beginning of the pandemic, there were lawmakers in the Senate who engaged in this minimalizing, just completely minimizing the severity of the pandemic, to the point where I actually didn't think that COVID was a serious threat to me, my health, my family's health. In fact, in February, I went on a cruise with my in-laws and had a great time and didn't think that COVID was going to be an issue. Then I find out, of course, a month later, everything starts shutting down. People I know get incredibly sick. And then news reports come out in regard to members of the Senate who had a classified briefing, closed-door briefing on the severity of COVID, and immediately turned around and started selling their stocks. They started buying tech stocks, realizing that people are likely to work home, so they might need to invest in technology or companies that offer technologies that make that possible. Basically, there's insider trading happening within the Senate. And I'm saying it out loud, and I'm saying it on a regular basis because that kind of activity, that type of behavior, first of all, is illegal for the average American, should not be legal for members of the Senate. The fact that we have lawmakers who are personally invested in businesses that they're deciding legislation on is unacceptable. So when you talk about the lack of trust in our institutions, I understand that lack of trust. And that lack of trust has led to the situation that we're experiencing today with COVID, where people don't believe in what the CDC is telling them, where people question what journalists are reporting about. They just assume, because of the lies that have been told, because of the system being rigged against them, they just assume that they're being lied to. And now we find ourselves in this difficult position where we're trying to find solutions. We're trying to come together so we combat COVID effectively, get people back to work so people can thrive, families can thrive. But that's incredibly difficult to do when people don't trust in our institutions.
So earlier this evening, three of us had some interesting conversations about the way that our culture is broken, the way that civility has broken down. Let me give you a couple of numbers that are actually pretty scary. 15% of Americans have terminated a friendship over political differences. The reality is 53% of the R's have a Democrat friend, only 32% of Democrats have a Republican friend. Granted, a lot of that is reported as being related to former President Trump. Kevin Drum, who I don't know, but is a liberal journalist with Mother Jones, said, quote, "If you hate culture wars, blame liberals." He wrote that in Washington Monthly. Is it fair to blame more liberals for the culture divide, or is it one that both sides have to take blame for?
I think that both sides certainly engage in manufactured culture wars, and it's frustrating to see it. Full disclosure, I myself have engaged in it, and I think instead of being oblivious or delusional about it, it's important to acknowledge when you've made the mistakes, right? And so the demonizing doesn't help. At the end of the day, we have to realize that we're all Americans. We all want the same thing. Fundamentally, we are the same. We might have different solutions, different ideas. Demonizing the other side doesn't help to accomplish any solutions. Again, we're seeing that play out in real time as we speak. I think that there's a market for the division, and that market is being exploited by our media. It's being exploited by politicians. And I mean, Facebook is in the news today. I think that Facebook, it makes money based on engagement, and people are engaged in the constant conflict. So it's important to be honest about what the real threats in society are. I think it's important to focus on why it is that, certain industries, including the media, engage in this culture of division. And we ought to talk about how the incentives are in the wrong place. I mean, there are no incentives to engage in, friendly conversation or friendly debate. I hate that my chair keeps, and I'm short, so I'm trying to figure out how to do this.
Place. I don't know.
I hate turning my back to people. Here, I'll just do this. I'll sit on the very edge. But we got to be aware of why it is that people engage in the divisive rhetoric that they engage in. There's a profit motive behind it oftentimes. I see it play out in the media. It's really, really hard not to fall victim to it myself, right? But when I take a step back and I look at where the country is right now, it's shameful. We don't see each other as fellow Americans. We don't see each other as even fellow colleagues or workers in the workplace. Everyone has a political identity, and that's it. And that's not helpful. I think the division in the country is incredibly embarrassing, especially on a world stage, and we got to be more cognizant of that as we engage in political discussions.
I certainly agree with an enormous amount of what Ana is saying about the nature of sort of the world that we live in, where people feel as though they are going to be ostracized socially. They feel that they might be fired depending on their political point of view. They feel as though if they make comments openly, and this is true for pretty much everybody across the political aisle, actually, with the exception of people who consider themselves on the far left. According to a Cato's study, basically every political subgroup in the United States feels uncomfortable speaking openly about what they believe, except if you're on the far left, because then you get to find people's old tweets and do that sort of stuff. But I'm not going to pretend that I think that the culture wars are irrelevant. I don't. I think that many of the culture wars are highly relevant, and not just relevant, I think that they may be indicative of sort of where the country is going. Because the way that most people experience interactions with the government, particularly the federal government or with politics generally, is not always based on tax rates or the very minute internecine debates that we have over $3.5 trillion bills that nobody knows what's in, and then everybody just votes before they read the thing. A lot of the way that people engage in politics... I'm sure we'll get into it, but I think that a lot of the ways that socially there's been a pretty strong push from the left over the course of the last 10 years in particular, and it's driven a lot of reactionary resentment on the part of people who are on the right. And I would suggest that a lot of the support for President Trump, for example, was driven by precisely that. It wasn't just about his economic program, which differed from sort of the traditional laissez-faire Republican economic program. A lot of it was about the idea that he was a culture warrior who was going to punish enemies and all of this. And so to pretend that the culture war either doesn't exist or that people are making it up in their imagination or that they are overestimating the impact of it on their life is to ignore how people are being treated in the spaces that they treat with every day, on Facebook, on Twitter, in the workplace. I mean, one of the reasons that my family and I left California is not just because of the living standard, although Florida is way better. It is also because we left a place where we felt as though our children were going to be socially ostracized for a place where we feel our children are not going to be socially ostracized, and that's a big thing.
Yeah. No, I mean, you actually brought up a few issues that I agree with. Number one issue is the constant policing of people's pasts, what they've said in the past. I think holding people to the current standards based on the current culture. If you're looking at tweets, for instance, from 2009, and you're judging that tweet based on what the current culture or the current standards are, it's a little ridiculous, right? So going around demonizing people based on their past statements, it shuts down a conversation that could be had, right? A conversation about, oh, hey, look, society has actually progressed on this, and look at what was okay. I mean, you have late night hosts who were in blackface not too long ago, right? But the culture has changed. I think that society as a whole, not everyone, but society as a whole has realized, oh, well, blackface has a pretty terrible history, and maybe it's not a good idea to dress like that as like a cute little Halloween costume. But beside the point, I don't think that the culture wars are fake. I think the culture wars are taking place. The point that I'm trying to make is that oftentimes, whatever the culture war is of that moment, it is manufactured as a distraction. A perfect example will be, critical race theory, which is not taught in elementary schools. Critical race theory is a graduate level curriculum. And the fact that it's turned into some weird, like, oh, we need to ban critical race theory in elementary schools, it's ridiculous and a massive distraction that I think is intentionally meant to be a distraction from what people are really feeling frustrated about. The precariousness of their lives, of their work lives, the fact that people feel overworked, that they have no control over the work that they're doing, that they feel alienated over the work that they're doing. These are very real issues, and I think that the fact that it's really largely been ignored by both the press and the very political leaders who were elected to represent them in the first place has led to the anger that we're seeing bubbling up both on the left and the right.
Ben, I think you wanted to make a couple comments.
Yeah, I mean, this will be a very quick note. I mean, I obviously disagree with you about critical race theory and whether it is taught in the public schools. Critical race theory, which I studied in law school, it started off as a legal theory, but it has an element of praxis that was meant to be implemented, which is why it is taught in education schools as well, and why
in elementary schools.
Yes,
though?
A very boiled down. I mean, Ibram X. Kendi is preaching a very boiled down version of critical race theory, and his book is assigned in elementary schools. I mean, the fact is that when you are having elementary school students who are having to check off boxes with regard to their race and then explain to each other whether they are historically privileged or not in 4th or 5th grade, that's a very dumbed down version of critical race theory. There's sort of a game that gets played with regard to legal theories that end up being boiled down. Intersectionality is another great example of this. Kimberly Crenshaw writes a very intelligent law review article about intersectionality and how you can be a member of more than one minority group and be discriminated against in a variety of ways. And then that is used as the basis for a much broader move in American political life. And then as soon as you point that out, they say, well, that's not intersectionality, it's the original law review article. That's a bit of no true Scotsman games playing. And so I object to that. And look, it is a relevant issue when you have Terry McAuliffe, who's running for governor of Virginia, literally saying in open debate that it should not be parents who are making the educational decisions for their children. It should be the people in education. I mean, that is a culture war issue that I think is of key importance to people who have kids, right?
Well, see, I mean, I think that that's part of what leads to the lack of trust in our institutions. I mean, yes, as a parent, you get to make decisions about which school you want your kid to go to. If you're uncomfortable with the public school curriculum, you can take a look at private school options. If you don't want that, you can homeschool. But who gets to be if we're talking about parents making those decisions, who gets to be the arbiter of, which parent gets to be the arbiter of what gets taught in any particular public school? I'm not really buying that they're learning about critical race theory or even a boiled down. I'm positive that, elementary schools are not learning about systemic racism. And even if they are, even if it's a boiled down version of that, learning about systemic racism is important. I think that that's something that's an issue in this country that gets ignored or completely denied, and I think that's wrong. I think that's what also leads to the division that we're experiencing.
Well, that's going to be the major culture war issue, right? Because the fact is that I, as a parent, believe that if you're going to teach...
You think there's no systemic racism?
I believe that it depends on how you define systemic racism. So if you're talking about legal regimens of racism, no. Mm-hmm. If you're talking about history has after effects, of course. So I think there's a real problem with semantic overload in a lot of our political conversations. And when people say systemic racism, sometimes what they mean by systemic racism is history has consequences. You can't have 150 years of, 300 years of slavery followed by Jim Crow and that not have after effects, which of course is true. And sometimes what they mean is that every inequality in American public life is due to some systemic inequity that is currently taking place in the United States, which I think is absolutely 100% false.
I mean, we certainly see that playing out in our criminal justice system. Are you going to deny that, or are you going to say that, let's say, African Americans or Latinos are just inherently more criminal or
I'm not going to say either of those things. I'm going to say that
so why are they overrepresented in our prisons?
I mean,
especially when you consider...
This may be beyond the scope of our conversation, but the answer is because not all groups commit crimes at the same level. That has nothing to do with genetics. That has
Right.
everything to do
So-
with circumstances.
Can you guys hold those
live in
thoughts on
culture.
education? Because I do want to get back to some of that too, but
Sure.
let me move on to something else we talked about. We talked about the trust issue, and there's some very interesting surveys out there on trust. Gallup did a survey. There's a drop across the board in trust in all institutions, except law enforcement, which is very interesting. Congress, sorry for my friends there, is the lowest. Media is down there almost as low as Congress. Those that rank the highest were small business and the military. So this low media rank, is that fair, or is that being manufactured as part of a culture war?
Oh, it's fair. I mean, it's entirely fair. I mean, I think that one of the things that we've seen for both good and bad, the fragmentation of media is a result of systemic distrust in the media, and that's existed for a very long time. I mean, that's nothing new. And I think that it's completely fair for people to look at the media. I know there are people on the left who think that the media is too right-wing, right? Obviously, we on the right think that the media is far too left-wing. But I think that sort of distrust in media sources is very often justified. I think that we're requiring more of people than we used to in the past, because once people have realized that there's an inherently political angle to how people cover the news, now we're asking them, if you want a full rounded diet, you actually have to choose it yourself, right? You have to cultivate yourself to watch the Young Turks and then watch my show and decide who you agree with, and where there's sort of a common locus of fact, that's the fact and everything else is the opinion. That's asking a lot of viewers, where we didn't used to ask very much of viewers at all, right? You just turn on the evening news and buy whatever Walter Cronkite is saying, whether it's true or not. I think most Americans waking up to that is a good thing. The systemic lack of trust in media has some bad downstream effects sometimes, because when there are no gatekeepers, there are no gatekeepers. So I like the fact that there are no gatekeepers, because I think the gatekeepers were very often biased, but without gatekeepers, sometimes bad stuff gets through.
Yeah, I mean, I think that right now we're experiencing people existing in various filter bubbles. So if you are, for instance, consuming most of your news online, if you like a particular brand of programming, if you, let's say, lean more conservative and you're watching mostly conservative news, algorithms offer up more and more conservative news. And so when you get if you have preconceived notions and all of a sudden you're hearing or reading something that challenges those preconceived notions, you're gonna have a negative reaction to it. And you see that playing out across the board. I'll give you an example. I mean, I have family members who are constantly consuming news online. My mom's a good example, right? You'd be surprised she's my mom, because she's on Facebook. She clicked on a link to, let's say, the Daily Wire, perfect example. Well, Facebook is gonna be offering up more Daily Wire type content. And then all of a sudden, when she's watching the Young Turks, she'll be like, well, you know, I read on Facebook, or I read on the Daily Wire, whatever, that X, Y, and Z happened, and you're wrong, right? That conversation doesn't actually happen that often, but I'm giving you an example.
I was hopeful there for a second.
Right? And so look, there are all sorts of issues with the media, right? I mean, the media for the longest time completely ignored the very real frustrations that workers have been feeling in this country. I mean, the Federal Reserve released data indicating that nearly half of Americans can't even afford a $400 emergency. At the same time, you tune into CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, I mean, it doesn't matter, across the board, and they're like, the economy is doing great. You know, we're seeing record growth, and what they're specifically talking about is the stock market. But the stock market is disconnected from the reality that the majority of workers are experiencing. So I think that that type of stuff leads to people feeling, you know, distrustful toward the press. At the same time, they exist in these filter bubbles and have their preconceived notions. It's hard to challenge that. So there's a lot of different things happening at the same time. I don't blame people for not being so trusting of the media. One other thing that I'll note is that the incentives are always in the wrong place. The kind of stories that I want to talk about on the Young Turks, and do talk about on the Young Turks, get no attention. They don't do well in terms of the number of views. I want to talk about international news. I want to talk about what's happening in Brazil. I want to talk about what's happening in Ecuador. It'll get like maybe 40,000 views at most. You know what gets a lot of views? I don't know, Ana Kasparian destroys this person, or here's the latest cat fight. Like, I hate it. It's garbage. It's garbage. Because it leads to people not trusting the press, but at the same time, the profits are there. The money is there. And I think you see that play out across the board, whether you're talking about cable news or online media.
And at the dinner table, we're having an interesting conversation. It's clearly a generational thing. My generation grew up watching Walter Cronkite and Huntley and Brinkley and all these folks. And one of the things that I saw in your bio was that you got interested in this field because of Barbara Walters. So what happens now to the Barbara Walters? I mean, where does news reporting go? Will the nightly news be a thing of the past? And are we simply going to continue to retreat to those mediums that demonstrate that we know everything already? Where's this going to go now?
Well, let me just note, I loved Barbara Walters on ABC's 2020. So I remember as a kid, like getting super excited after TGIF was over because ABC's 2020 would be on. And I was like fascinated by the fact that this woman was getting paid to talk to these incredibly interesting people from around the world. And I was just fascinated by the conversations. That's how I got interested in journalism and the media. But I just feel like the type of conversations that she had, or just news about world events, they don't seem to attract the kind of attention that they used to. And it might be because of an oversaturated market. It might be because conflict tends to sell. Manufactured conflicts tend to sell. But I wish we can get back to a place where journalism still really existed, where there was like ethical standards that were, that reporters abided by, anchors abided by. I wish there was a clear distinction between opinion and actual hard news journalism. This is what I talk about with my journalism students whenever I have the time to teach. I always tell them, I'm like, look, there's a difference between what I do, which is analysis, opinion, and what you should be doing as an investigative journalist, for instance. Going out there and actually gathering the news, talking to both sides, not equating both sides and acting as if you're completely neutral, but making sure that you gather the facts on the ground and report them as they are. It's really hard to find that these days. There's still great journalism taking place. I wouldn't be able to do my analysis or my job without that great journalism taking place. But these are the people who are oftentimes not paid well, ignored, and don't get any of the benefits that someone might in the media if you engage in the conflict nonsense.
Can we go back, Ben, and separate the fact-based from the opinion now, or is it going to be conflated for the foreseeable future?
I think the truth is that was a relatively modern construct. If you go back to the foundations of the Republic, the people who were reporting were also doing opinion, and that was true all the way through the beginning of the 20th century. It was really only with Walter Lippmann in the 1920s that you start talking about objective standards in journalism. And there's a difference between an objective standard that you apply to how a story is reported and being an objective reporter, meaning you have no politics at all. And I think, frankly, if you want to reinstall some sort of institutional trust, it would be good for reporters to say, here's who I voted for, and then here are also the facts that I am reporting on, because otherwise it ends up being a gotcha, right? I see how you're reporting that. I see what you're doing. I know what you really think about this story. So that's a major issue. I think the other big issue, obviously, I mentioned gatekeepers before. I'm very wary of the reinstallation of institutional gatekeepers, because if you want to talk about market incentives, the big players have all the incentives to ensure that they are the ones who maintain their access via the gates. And this is one of my great fears with some sites that we've been very successful with, like Facebook, is that reestablishing the idea that there are quote-unquote trusted news sources, and those all coincidentally are legacy media sources, means that everybody who's not a legacy media source, somebody who started up a company in the last 10 years, right, we opened our doors in 2015, we're not legacy media. And so we don't have that legacy. So now you're shutting out all the players who are actually entering the market.
So you actually mentioned, again, just a little bit of a shift because you got my attention earlier. You're both born and raised in California. You left, you stayed, but we had an interesting conversation at the dinner table that maybe your perspectives on California aren't all that different. Ben, I know you said you were afraid your kids were going to have a difficult time because of their political views. So are you sad that you left California? Or tell us?
I have not thought for one day about that decision. That was it was one of the best decisions that I have ever made for my family. We are overjoyed. Florida is a wonderful state. Basically, because of my Orthodox Jewish faith, that means that I had to move to a place that had some significant Jewish resources. And so I was looking for a place that had those resources, was in a red state, preferably with 0% state income tax. And that narrowed it down to basically Dallas and Florida. And so we ended up in Florida. It's wonderful. But I mean, it wasn't just that. It was really a lifestyle thing, because my wife for years was saying, yeah, we're paying higher taxes, but you make a lot of money. So, you know, that's fine. But the problem is you don't get any of the public services back in California. So in our area, which was a fairly decent suburb, you had just an inundation of homelessness in the area. Like, my kids could not walk around the neighborhood. We'd open up our front gate. There'd be a person shooting heroin in their foot literally in front of our house, or a person passed out on the street. We had our business on Ventura Boulevard. We had to board up windows during the George Floyd, you know, some protests, some riots. We had, you know, there was a homeless person who smashed the front plate glass window of our establishment. When we left and we moved our main business to Nashville, and then my family and a small core of the business moved to Florida. When we left, we thought that we were going to lose probably half the people working for us. Instead, I think over 90% of the people were like, "You're going, get us out of here." Everybody wanted out. There's a reason people are leaving California.
Well, Ana, you shared some concerns too, and California, like Pennsylvania, lost another congressional seat, so their population is not growing, certainly not at the same rate as Texas, Florida, et cetera. So share some of your concerns, because you talked a little bit about it before.
Sure. So California is poorly governed right now. You know, I was pretty blunt and transparent about the fact that I signed the petition to recall Gavin Newsom. So
I signed it too. We were on exactly the same page before I left.
Right. Now, unfortunately, the individuals running against him were worse than he was or is. And so, unfortunately, when the ballot showed up to in my mailbox, I ended up voting against the recall. But I was hoping that there would be a better candidate to challenge him. I didn't like any of the candidates. Now, the reason why I've decided to stay in California is because I love the state. I know what the state is capable of, and I would much rather stay and fight to make the state better in any capacity that I have. But with that said, the issues in California are endless. You have corruption. I mean, literally a city council member had his office raided by the FBI because of the pay-for-play scheme that he was engaged in. You have real estate developers running amok. You know, you have this effort to build public housing to alleviate some of the homelessness, but at the same time, you know, you have the lawmakers in the state giving these sweetheart deals to developers who are very clearly inflating their prices and taking forever to build said public housing. So there's all sorts of mismanagement. I disagree with the way that they're handling the homelessness issue as well, although I think my solutions might be a little different. I think that this idea of you know, being incredibly laxed with camping has been pretty disastrous and has attracted, homelessness isn't just a California issue, it's an issue throughout the country. But when other states are pretty strict against encampments and California is very lax, what do you think that's going to do? It's going to attract homelessness in the state as well. I want to provide housing for everyone. I consider it a human right. But I think the way that the state is doing it through a public-private partnership has not worked out at all.
Thank you. So let's move on to another public policy issue, one that's being debated in Washington right now. Tax the rich is a very popular sentiment. It's also now a fashion statement, I guess, which we've all seen. So when President Biden looks into the microphone and says, "Pay your fair share," what does that mean?
It means that if you're one of the 55 corporations that literally paid absolutely nothing in federal income taxes in 2020, and in fact received $3.5 billion in tax refunds or rebates, or tax refunds, I should say, maybe you should pay your fair share. But here's the thing, if the tax code is written in a way where corporations can legally take advantage of loopholes and incredibly low effective corporate tax rates, they're gonna do it, right? So it's one thing to say pay your fair share, it's another thing to actually write a tax code that is a little more equitable and ensures that everyone is in fact paying their fair share.
Ben, what's pay your fair share mean?
I mean, the obvious answer would be a flat tax, but the longer answer is that the United States has one of the most progressive income tax systems on planet Earth. Most of the systems in, for example, Northern Europe are far less progressive. The top tax rate kicks in a lot lower on the income scale because you have to pay for the large-scale social services. The people who are at the top of the income bracket in the United States, the top quintile essentially pays all net taxes in the United States. Not some, not most, all. And the reason for that is because there are tax transfers and the transfer of payments that are inherent in public services services do not accrue to the people at the top of the tax bracket. They accrue to everybody else who's receiving that sort of funding. When we talk about higher taxes on corporations, we do not have one of the world's lowest corporate tax rates. We are somewhere in the middle. Look at the OECD countries. We are certainly not the lowest on the totem pole in terms of our corporate tax rate. In fact, right-wing sources like the Heritage Foundation will say that it is much friendlier to do business in places like Denmark or Sweden in many cases than it is to do business in the United States.
Tax rate's pretty high in Denmark and Sweden.
It is. The personal income tax rate is very high in Denmark and Sweden. The corporate tax rate is basically near or on par with that of the United States. If we were to raise our corporate tax rate the way that President Biden is talking about, we'd actually have a higher corporate tax rate than China currently does. The notion that corporations ought to be paying tax at all, in my view, is mistaken, given the fact that the income is immediately either reinvested in the company or passed on to people who immediately pay all of that tax. By the time you actually receive your income in this country, the income's been taxed about 7 different ways. Right? You're getting taxed through the corporation, then it's passed on to you as salary, which is taxed. If you invest it in the stock market and then you sell your stock, that is taxed as capital gains tax. When you die, the government taxes that as well. So how many times can you tax the same dollar before people begin to disinvest?